Lamed Vav Amud Beis, 36b. We're in the middle of our discussion, part 2 of our discussion with respect to Tefillin at night and Tefillin on Shabbos. And we concluded yesterday by saying that in framing the issue and going forward, that there are two considerations, each of which have two options. One is the distinction between putting on tefillin versus leaving your tefillin on your head, meaning putting on tefillin at night versus you're wearing tefillin by day and for some reason you're leaving it on when nighttime hits. That's question number one. And then number two, can you pass the tissues, please? Thank you. And number two, excuse me. Thank you. And number two is the issue of Shabbos and Yom Tov versus night. Those are the two times we don't put on tefillin, and is there a difference between the two of them? So we left off yesterday was that there is a difference. And we cited an individual named Rabbi Bar Avona, sage, who on the one hand said or implied that as soon as it's nighttime, you are to take off your tefillin. Never mind, you can't put them on, you have to actually take them off. He also said that it was also said of him that he used to wear tefillin during Ma'ariv. How's that? Because he's of the view that we mentioned yesterday, Rabbi Yaakov's view, which says at the time of tefillin goes till a time while people are still in the marketplace, and people are still in the marketplace well after nightfall. So he's davening Ma'ariv, still wearing his tefillin. So his statement and his practice seem to contradict each other. And the Gemara answered by saying that when he said you are to take off your tefillin when it hits nightfall, that's talking about Shabbos. And therefore Shabbos, the prohibition or the time when Shabbos says not to put on tefillin is right when Shabbos hits, namely, at nightfall, and therefore take off your tefillin. But during the week, where the only prohibition is not an issue of Shabbos, the only prohibition of tefillin is an issue of night. And in his view, nighttime with respect to tefillin begins when the marketplace is empty, and thus it's sometime after nightfall. Clear? And therefore he would wear tefillin sometimes during Ma'ariv. This is where we are right now. Clear? Okay, so now it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines from the top of the page. Last word, itmar. Itmar, we have been taught, but when the different ways the Gemara introduces a teaching, Tanan Rabbanon, Tanya, the Tanan, each of these things mean something, but generally speaking, anytime it's introduced with Taf at the beginning, a Tanya, the Tanan, then it's a Mishnaic age text, and if it's Itmar, it means it's from a post-Mishnaic age where someone's teaching the following. And the Gemara says as follows: Itmar has been taught in a post-Mishnaic tradition. I'm not going to say text because I don't think it was published at the time where the Mishnah was, but it's a tradition. Maika Savar. What's the viewpoint here? What does he hold? This Rav Huna, he used to wear tefillin during Ma'ariv, but still says, and therefore he's of the view that you can technically wear tefillin at night, but for some reason you're supposed to not put them on after the marketplace is empty. At the same time, he said that on Shabbos, as soon as Shabbos hits, you take your tefillin off. So what's his view? Ikas of our Laila's man tefillin. If he's of the view that nighttime is an appropriate time to wear tefillin, and that's why he was wearing it during Ma'ariv, then Shabbos nami's man tefillin. Then Shabbos should also be a time of tefillin. Now, at this point, the Gemara is connecting the two. We're saying that they're two separate issues, as I framed it yesterday. At the moment, the Gemara is assuming that they're the same, and we'll explain why. Now, Shabbos allows man tefillin, but if he's of the view that Shabbos is not the time to wear tefillin, and that's why he said take them off when Shabbos hits, then nami's man tefillin, lav's man tefillin. Then night should also be considered the time not to wear tefillin. Why? The same verse that excludes Shabbos from the obligation of wearing tefillin, mahasam, from that very place, is where nighttime is excluded. In other words, the Gemara is saying that we're about to cite a text where the prohibition or the exclusion of Shabbos, Yom Tov, and night as times to wear tefillin, we're excluding them and saying that they're not times to wear tefillin. At this moment, the Gemara is assuming that they come from the same verse. Now, if they come from the same verse, then if you say no wearing tefillin on Shabbos, then no wearing tefillin at night. If you say yes wearing tefillin at night, then yes wearing tefillin on Shabbos. which further complicates Rav Huna's view, who on the one hand said, take off your tefillin as soon as Shabbos arrives. On the other hand, he was wearing tefillin at Ma'ariv. If they're not wearing tefillin on Shabbos and they're not wearing tefillin at night come from the same verse, then you have to have both, or none. Can't have one or the other. So let's see. Where's this verse that has both of these teachings? The Tanya, before we've learned. The verse reads, quote, now we're quoting Mishnaic H text, which quotes a verse. The verse reads, V'shamarta sachuk hazois, you shall guard or keep this statute, this law, l'mayada in its time, miyamim, from the days, yamima, in its day. Okay. So you have two times where the verse says days. One saying in its day, and one saying from its days. Meaning, yamim, when it says the days, that means v'leilela, it's not time, not night. Miyamim, from the days, meaning some days are to be excluded. V'lei kol yamim, and not all days, because it's from the days. Prat, this excludes Shabbos Yom Tovim, Shabbos and Yom Tov. Divid Rabbi Yosef Glili, this is the words of Rabbi Yosef Glili. Rabbi Yosef Glili is saying, there's one verse that says, keep the statue from the days in its days. This double expression means day, not night, weekday, not Shabbos and Yom Tov. So in this understanding, the exclusion of tefillin from both night and Shabbos comes from the same verse. And therefore, you either agree with this teaching and say Shabbos is not time for tefillin and night is not time for tefillin, and therefore no tefillin and Ma'ariv, and take them off when Shabbos arrives. Or you say, I ignore this teaching, and therefore you could wear tefillin at Ma'ariv, and therefore there's no reason to take them off when Shabbos arrives. Which leaves the question in Rav Huna, why Rav Huna on the one hand said he wore tefillin at night, at Ma'ariv. At the same time, he said take them off when Shabbos comes. Clear? But there's another view, which is Rabbi Kiva. Rabbi Kiva says, this verse, which says, guard this law in its days for the days, says it's not, this is Rabbi Kiva. This is not with respect to tefillin, but rather El Pesach Bavad. It's talking about the law of Pesach, that it's to be done during the day and only in its time, meaning Erev Pesach or Pesach Sheni, or the second Pesach, but not any other time of the year. Okay, now if that's the case, that means Rabbi Kiva disregards Rabbi Yosef Glili's teaching. So at this point, we might say that Rav Huna follows Rabbi Kiva, but then that means he should allow tefillin on Shabbos also. Right? Because Rabbi Kiva is ignoring that original teaching, which excludes both Shabbos and excludes nighttime from tefillin. So you might suggest that Rabbi Huna is following Rabbi Kiva. Fine. If that's the case, he should allow you to wear tefillin on Shabbos. Why is he telling you to take it off when Shabbos arrives? So the Gemara says as follows: Nafkale mehechad nafkale Rabbi Kiva. Rav Huna comes to his conclusion from the same place Rabbi Kiva comes to his conclusion, because there's actually another statement from Rabbi Kiva where he does exclude Shabbos from wearing tefillin, but doesn't exclude night. So Rabbi Kiva, which ignores Rabbi Yossi's teaching. Rabbi Yossi's teaching, Rabbi Yosef Glili's teaching excludes both Shabbos and night from the same verse. Rabbi Kiva says, I'm not with that. That's talking about Pesach. But I have another verse which tells me that Shabbos is not the time for tefillin, whereas it doesn't exclude night. And therefore you could say, I follow Rabbi Kiva in that Shabbos is not time for tefillin, but nighttime is where time for tefillin. And therefore, everyone would say, when it comes Shabbos, take off your tefillin, but at night, good morning, but at night, you could wear tefillin during Ma'ariv. So let's see, where's the verse that Rabbi Kiva comes to the conclusion that Shabbos is not time for tefillin? Tanya, if we've taught the first line of the wide lines, Rabbi Kiva says, Yachal yaniach adam tefillin b'Shabbos v'Yom Tovim. One might have assumed, or one might think, that a person should wear tefillin on Shabbos and Yom Tov. Talmud Leimar comes to the verse and says, V'haya la'oisa yadecha u'tavit b'nenecha. That tefillin should be for a sign on your hands and teitafos and a remembrance on your eyes or on your head. So Rabbi Kiva interprets the verse. Misha tzrichin ois, tefillin is only to be worn when someone requires a sign. On ois, Yotzi Shabbos Yom Tovim. This excludes the days of Shabbos and Yom Tov. Shehein guf on ois, where they themselves are on ois, they are a sign. The verse says, Oisi beini benechem, Shabbos and Yom Tov are a sign between Hashem and the Jewish people. Tefillin are a sign between the Jewish people, and there's a third mitzvah which is a sign between the Jewish people and Hashem. The Bris Milah. So there are three. So there's discussion about that. The bottom line is that a person should have two oisis. A person should have two signs always of his covenant with Hashem. One's his bris, and then during the weekday it's tefillin, and on Shabbos and Yom Tov it's Shabbos. And because Shabbos and Yom Tov themselves are a sign, no need for tefillin. So here Rabbi Kiva has a verse which excludes Shabbos and Yom Tov from the obligation of tefillin, but doesn't exclude nighttime. He doesn't say nighttime is not time for tefillin, and therefore Rabbi Yehuna says, like Rabbi Kiva, take off your tefillin on Shabbos, but at night he was still wearing his tefillin at Ma'ariv. So at this point, it should be important to explain, and this remains the actual halacha. Because this is the halacha, we're going to pause here just to put the halacha in, then we'll continue. Because the Gemara is going to continue with opinions that are not the halacha necessarily. So the halacha is like Rabbi Kiva, in that Shabbos and Yom Tov is not time for tefillin because of this verse. Now, not only that, because it's derived from a verse, it's actually a biblical prohibition to put on tefillin on Shabbos and Yom Tov. And thus, one who puts tefillin on Shabbos and Yom Tov, this is what the Alter Rebbe writes, one who puts on tefillin on Shabbos and Yom Tov, with the intention that I'm putting them on for the purpose of fulfilling a mitzvah, he has violated the prohibition of Baal Tosef. Right? We've talked about this before. There's a prohibition against adding to mitzvahs. So here, Torah says, you're not required to wear tefillin on Shabbos and Yom Tov. Torah says that, according to Rabbi Kiva, it's an actual biblical verse which excludes Shabbos and Yom Tov to say that you're not supposed to put on tefillin. And so if you put on tefillin on Shabbos and Yom Tov for the sake of fulfilling the commandment, then you will have added to the commandments. But if you put them on for the sake of saving them, not for the sake of the mitzvah, you find tefillin on the streets and Shabbos, you don't want them to get ruined, so you put them on so you can carry them home. You know how to carry, so you wear them. No, it's a real thing. Yeah. Or a person's walking around before Shabbos starts, and this is the Gemara in Beitza that talks about this. The Gemara over here doesn't mention it for some reason, but the Gemara in Beitza does, where a person's wearing tefillin before Shabbos, and he doesn't want to take them off, he doesn't want to carry, he's worried about getting them lost. Mm-hmm. So he covers them with his hands so no one should think he's put on tefillin on Shabbos, and he keeps on wearing them. So the prohibition of this is again with this overlapping issue, right? There's the issue of leaving them on versus putting them on. So here it's a biblical prohibition to put on tefillin on Shabbos for the sake of a mitzvah, but if you're putting them on for some other reason, or you're leaving them on to protect them, they shouldn't get ruined or whatever it is, then you may keep on wearing them. That's with respect to Shabbos and Yom Tov. Now what about at nighttime? Rav Huna, if you found them on the streets, Shabbos, you can put them on and walk with them? That's right. You should. You don't make a bracha. Rather, God forbid, it's not a mitzvah. That's right. That's what I just finished saying. If you're putting them on for the mitzvah, you're violating commandments, you're making a bracha, then you're doing it for the mitzvah. That would be violation. Right? It's not about to see. Baal Tosef is only when you're putting it off for the sake of the mitzvah. If you're putting them on to guard them, for protection, to protect them. Only with the intention of doing a mitzvah. Like generally speaking, the prohibition of Baal Tosef always. If you're doing it because you're doing it for the sake of the mitzvah when you're not supposed to. Yeah, the same question is raised about sukkah. We said the sukkah, if you have the sukkah, you can be Baal Tosef. Which is why you make a bracha. Yeah. Now, one second. Now, two more items before we can just. What's with the night? 1 second. It's now nighttime. Mm-hmm. So, according to Rabbi Aglili, the prohibition of wearing tefillin at night is biblical, because he quotes a verse which says not night. We rejected that because we're taking Rabbi Kiva, and therefore we take only the verse which excludes Shabbos and Yom Tov from tefillin. However, here's an interesting thing: the Rambam actually says it's a biblical prohibition to wear tefillin at night, but doesn't quote the verse of Rabbi Aglili for both. He quotes Rabbi Aglili's verse Miyamim Yamima to exclude nighttime, and said that at night it's also a prohibition to wear tefillin at night, biblical prohibition, but then quotes the verse of Rabbi Kiva for Shabbos and Yom Tov, which is interesting. Why he does that? Halacha Rabbi Kiva mechaveirov, but not mechaveirov. So the Rambam is indeed of the view that the prohibition of wearing tefillin at Shabbos and the prohibition of wearing tefillin at night are both biblical, but from two different verses. Night, he quotes the verse of Rabbi Aglili, which says Miyam Yamima, the first verse, which says days of days. And when it comes to Shabbos, he quotes the verse of Rabbi Kiva, which says a sign, and Shabbos itself is a sign, and therefore not Yom Tov. Now, what's the chumrah here? What's the difference if it's biblical or rabbinic? Because he also agrees that if it's on your head and you're keeping them on for protection, you're allowed to leave them on. What's the difference? It would seem to me that the difference is he doesn't mention halacha. We mentioned yesterday the opening statement was a person who wakes up early in the morning to travel and he doesn't want to lose his tefillin, so he puts on tefillin at night, right? And then he travels, and when daytime hits, he moves his tefillin around and makes a bracha, because that's when there's time to make the bracha, because before then was before the time, right? So the Rambam doesn't mention that halacha. Doesn't mention it. Which means we might infer he doesn't mention halacha. Plus he says it's a biblical prohibition to wear tefillin at night. So we might actually infer it. You're not allowed to do that according to the Rambam. We might infer. It doesn't say so explicitly, but we might infer so. And you're actually not allowed to do that. However, yeah?
What do you mean by wearing? You said he moves them. Does that mean that before you're supposed to say the bracha, you put them on, and then in the incorrect or
no, he put them on properly.
Way?
He put them on properly, but he just moves them around.
Oh, okay.
Just moves them around in its location with the bracha.
He puts them on early, like he puts them like.
He woke up at 2 in the morning He woke up 2 in the morning to travel.
Yeah, but he puts it on correctly.
Puts it on correctly, and when it comes daytime, it's time to make a bracha. He moves it around in its place and makes a bracha. This is the halacha we mentioned yesterday, but the Rambam does not mention that halacha. Plus, he says that the prohibition of wearing tefillin at night is biblical, which we might infer from that. The Rambam is actually of the view that if you wake up early and you want to travel, you cannot put on your tefillin until it's daytime. Period. However, that's the Rambam writes that, but the Shulchan Aruch does not say that. The Shulchan Aruch says as follows: the prohibition of Shabbos and Yom Tov is indeed biblical, as I mentioned before, and therefore you cannot put on the tefillin on Shabbos and Yom Tov for the sake of the mitzvah. If you happen to be wearing it before and you're trying to protect them, or you found them on the street and you want to protect them, then you're allowed to, but you cannot put it on for the sake of the mitzvah. But when it comes to nighttime, the Shulchan Aruch does not say a verse. We're taking Rabbi Akiva's view, not Rabbi Yosef Lili's view. So what's the issue with wearing tefillin at night? The only issue is you might fall asleep. You might fall asleep. That's the only problem. You might fall asleep when you're wearing tefillin. Now if that's the case, right? So then there are times when a person could wear tefillin at night, and we'll learn about how ein moedin came. We don't instruct people to do it because the person might fall asleep. But if it so happened the person need because he's traveling, whatever it is, and then again the same thing applies. A person wakes up early in the morning. So there's no prohibition against wearing tefillin biblically. The only problem is he might fall asleep. Now he just slept the whole night. So we're not worried he's going to fall asleep. Moreover, the Alter writes that this halacha of putting on tefillin in the morning or middle of the night before he travels, 2 in the morning before it's the daytime, and he puts on his tefillin because he doesn't want to lose them, is only if he's walking when he's traveling, which requires him to be awake. But if he's sitting in a wagon, or he's going to go on an airplane, or he's going to sleep in a seat, don't put on your tefillin. Because again, the prohibition of putting on tefillin at night is the issue of falling asleep. So if the scenario is such that you're not going to fall asleep, don't put on your tefillin. We're not worried about it. Whereas the Rambam doesn't mention that halacha because it seems the Rambam says it's biblical to wear tefillin at night. We clear on the halacha? Okay. One more thing I want. Yes?
Why are you afraid of falling asleep? What's the problem?
A person might his body. A person's not in control.
Yes.
Not control of his body.
It's disrespectful.
It's disrespectful to the tefillin. Yeah.
You may pass gas while asleep, not aware of it. So
Yeah.
wearing
You
tefillin
said
is
you
not
had to have
proper.
two
So
sides.
you
What
have
if
more
you don't have a
control
bris?
than me.
Yeah, well, you don't
Excuse
have to.
me.
That's an interesting question. A very, very interesting question. I want to mention that. Thanks for reminding me. I actually want to mention that. I forgot. The Sefer. I want to say it's Sefer Truma. No, Truma Sadeshin maybe. So I read this a long time ago, but it's a very interesting question. So the halacha is, we just understand that the person's supposed to have 2 signs, bris and Shabbos, and then, or bris and tefillin. Now what if a person doesn't have a bris? Now why would a person not have a bris? Either didn't get one for whatever reason, but there are even times when halachically a person is allowed to not have a bris. How is that? A woman who gives birth to two children, and each of her 2 sons, God forbid, die during the bris. Then the 3rd child is not required to have a bris. Is it the 3rd or the 4th? I think it's the 3rd.
Third.
The 3rd is not required to have a bris. So here's an individual who's living his life with the permission of halacha not having a bris. So does he have to wear tefillin at night on Shabbos? This is a question raised by Sefer Tumas Hadeshin, and if I remember correctly, there's also a smag about this. No, the smag mentions about the 2 signs. And the Tumas Hadeshin asks about it. I could be getting the people wrong, but the bottom line is that he concludes that we don't make a distinction between Jewish people. So all the Jewish people have a bris. And the fact that he doesn't have a bris is a technicality within that law, but he still has the sign. He just technically doesn't have it on his body because he doesn't have to. But he still has, the sign still exists for all Jews because all Jews are required to have a bris. But that very same halacha, which says all Jews are required to have a bris, says he doesn't have to have one. Unless he's not excluded from the sign, he's just excluded from the technical circumcision. That's basically the answer.
He didn't have a bris because he came from a place that they didn't have a bris.
Then he should get one, ASAP. You should get one as soon as possible. This is our covenant. Right? Even so, he wouldn't put on tefillin on Shabbos, I don't think.
But even during the week, he has only one sign, only the tefillin.
Yeah, even during
But you can't. Then he can't do anything. You can't transplant Shabbos to Sunday. But you could put on tefillin on Shabbos, right?
But because what you said
Just
before,
because
that just because he's a Jew, part of the group, so it's as if he has a sign on him.
One could argue that that's only if a person has the halacha's permission not to have a bris. One could make that argument, but I'm not going to rule on that. Okay. One last thing about the halacha before we continue. Yeah.
Sorry, would he have to put on his tefillin during, for example, during the holidays?
Chol HaMoed.
Yeah.
That's what I want to talk about right now. So the next thing is the exclusion of Shabbos and Yom Tov from part of the Tefillin commandment is because the verse says because Shabbos and Yom Tov is already a sign. And the question is, what makes Shabbos and Yom Tov the sign? There are two options. Either all of the things you're obligated to do on the holidays make it a sign. So namely, on Pesach and Sukkot, those are the only two times you have Chol HaMoed. Shavuos is no Chol HaMoed anyway. So it's Pesach and Sukkot. So what makes Pesach and Sukkot a sign? One could argue, now what makes it a sign is the obligations that you have on that day. Namely, Pesach, the prohibition of eating chametz, and the prohibition of eating chametz, and at least not the biblical requirement, but some requirement to eat matzah, or let's just say the prohibition of eating chametz. And on Sukkot, the obligation to eat in the sukkah. Now the prohibition to eat chametz exists on Chol HaMoed, and the obligation to eat in the sukkah exists on Chol HaMoed. Now if that's the definition of your sign, then on Chol HaMoed, you shouldn't wear your tefillin. And that's the Chabad custom. However, Sfardim also? Sfardim also?
Even Ashkenazim
No,
as
excuse
well,
me.
Even some Ashkenazim?
Thought in Shalom about
It's-
it
it's-
too.
Yeah,
it's
okay.
interesting
We don't
that-
go
yeah,
back.
the
The Ramah says everybody, that's what I was going to say.
His minhag is to put on Chol HaMoed, but it seems in like east of Poland, like in Russia, Lithuania, they did.
But even Alter Rebbe writes that the minig be'golius elu. Even though the Alter Rebbe, so I was going to say, well, let me just finish and I'll tell you, but it's interesting, I don't know.
Yeah, because I know.
Maybe because the Aruch what does the Aruch HaShulchan say?
I'm gonna check them. I know the Litvish don't put on tefillin.
I didn't know that.
Or some they're machmer, they put on tefillin at home.
Without a bracha.
Without a bracha.
Okay, so I want to just finish
They
this.
don't wear it in their stuff.
That's very interesting. But Alter Rebbe says, so,
Chol HaMoed.
okay, so this is all, you would be skipping, you wouldn't be wearing tefillin on Chol HaMoed if you're of the view that what makes Shabbos and Yom Tov a sign, what makes Yom Tov a sign are the obligations you have, namely not eating chametz or eating in the sukkah, which exists on Chol HaMoed, and therefore no tefillin on Chol HaMoed. However, if what you define as the sign of Shabbos and Yom Tov is not the obligations you have, but rather the resting, the fact that you're not allowed to work,
Isser Malacha.
Isser Malacha, the violation, the prohibition against doing creative work. So that is only on Yom Tov, not on Chol HaMoed. On Chol HaMoed you're allowed to do work. Now if that's the way you define the sign, then you should be wearing tefillin on Shabbos and Yom Tov. On Chol HaMoed, I'm sorry.
It should be Achom.
Now you're saying that Ramah says, I know that Ramah says that in our communities we do wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed because he takes the view that sign is the prohibition from work. The Alter Rebbe indeed writes here, V'chein nagu lamad aleph. V'chein nagu b'chol galuyos elu. And this is indeed the custom in all of our exiles, which seems to me to be in all of Ashkenaz.
Where in Chol HaMoed?
Sorry?
Where-
A Chol HaMoed. Yeah, we're talking about Chol HaMoed now. But you're saying that even Litvish don't either.
Yeah, they don't.
So I don't know, that's interesting. But anyway, in the footnote here, he tells you to look up the Rebbe's letter, and the halach, the Chabad custom is not to wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed. And there are those who taka, like you mentioned, wear it at home and don't make a bracha because it's a Baruch Lachel. But not, and even so, you run into another issue, which is if you're not supposed to be wearing tefillin. Like we mentioned before, that on Shabbos, if you put on tefillin for the sake of the mitzvah, you're violating the commandment of Baal Tosef, not to add to the mitzvah. Right, you're not allowed to add to a mitzvah. So you mentioned earlier that because on Shabbos you're not supposed to wear tefillin. If you put on tefillin for the sake of the mitzvah, you're violating the commandment to add to the mitzvah. Because you're adding a day. Now, if according to the view which says Chol Hamoed, you're not supposed to wear tefillin, then you're also violating that commandment. But the Rebbe says not to worry about that, because you're doing it out of doubt.
That's tough, exactly.
So it's not a problem.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's with regard to the halacha. But now we're going to get back to the Gemara. So
With one interesting point.
Yeah.
It's good to know that the last day of Yom Tov, Chutz La'aretz, we don't put on tefillin. It's very interesting because Midaraisa.
isn't that amazing?
Exactly.
It's an amazing thing. It's an amazing thing that the power that Chachamim have.
Yeah, I want to make the point. Yeah.
That even though biblically speaking, you should be wearing tefillin on Simchas Torah because it's not biblically a holiday, and Israel are wearing tefillin, and yet we're not wearing tefillin because it's still Yom Tov. Because the sages say it's still Yom Tov. It's a very beautiful thing. It's true.
Which is which day?
Simchas Torah, or last day of Pesach, or second day of Shavuos, any second day Yom Tov.
Oh, second day Yom
There's
Tov.
only one day.
Okay, even second day of Rosh Hashanah.
Includes.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's with respect to halacha. We have a few minutes. I want to get back to the Gemara. So now when I get back to the Gemara, I'm just remembering, you have to keep in mind that the Gemara is the place from which the conclusions I just said came from. And therefore we're going to read some stuff that are contradictory to what I just finished saying. So what I finished saying is the halacha from the conclusion. But we're going to be saying things that precede this conclusion, and therefore don't get alarmed. They're going to be contradictions. Different views.
Did talk about night. We don't know what he holds by night.
We don't know what to hold by night, but we're going but by night. The reason why I went with this whole exercise is I want to explain to you. And therefore, Rav Huna is of the view that the only time we're concerned about you falling asleep is not from the sunset, but from when the market's empty. And therefore we wear tefillin by Ma'ariv. Right? So all the discussions we had before about when night tefillin, at which point that night is the last time to put on tefillin, it's all a question of when do we worry you're going to fall asleep.
That's right.
Except for according to the Rambam, which says there's an actual prohibition of wearing tefillin at night, biblically speaking, and therefore it starts right away at night. And the same thing true in the morning.
Put tefillin on mincha?
Sorry?
On mincha. At mincha. There's some people that put tefillin.
Sure, there's people that wear tefillin all day.
So
Yeah. We're going to talk about that tomorrow when we talk about Hesach Hadas. We'll talk about those who wear tefillin all day. We'll talk more about that tomorrow, God willing. But
the definition of night here with the
right, so it's all a question of when we're worried you're going to fall asleep. Right, because that's the prohibition if in our halachic view. And therefore, to come to understand the reason why I give this whole exercise to understand the resolution of Rav Huna's two statements. On the one hand, Rav Huna said take off your tefillin when Shabbos hits because he's of Rabbi Akiva's view, which says that Shabbos is a biblical prohibition of wearing tefillin, so take it off. But during the week, the only issue is you may fall asleep. And here Rav Huna says, so long as people are still in the market, we're not worried you're going to fall asleep, so you can wear your tefillin. And therefore, he's of the view that you wear tefillin even during
It's not
Ma'ariv.
conditional upon night. It's conditional upon you falling asleep.
It's conditional. It's not an issue of the nighttime. It's an issue of falling asleep. Correct. And the same thing is true with when. The same thing is true of when tefillin in the morning starts. If it's too early, even if it's technically morning, we're still worried you're going to fall back asleep. And therefore, the tefillin begins a little bit later than say Shema or other commandments which start in the morning. It starts Mishiyakir, which means it has to be light enough outside for you to be able to identify your friend. Then we know it's full on morning and you're fully awake.
And people who would wear tefillin all day, like today, if somebody's wearing tefillin all day, is that person going to work, or is that person because he's studying Torah all day?
We're going to talk about that tomorrow, God willing, but he could be going to work. He has to be at a very high level. We'll talk about that tomorrow, God willing, because tomorrow we're going to learn about the prohibition of, or the commandment to concentrate and keep your attention while you're wearing your tefillin, and we'll talk about that tomorrow and how you do that if you're wearing tefillin all day. Okay, but let's see if we conclude today's Gemara today, before we get to tomorrow. Okay, so now let's continue the Gemara. Now again, we're going to read some opinions that are not halachically upheld, but they're in the Gemara, so we're going to learn them obviously. Rabbi Lezer says, Kol maniach tefillin, anyone who wears tefillin achash kiyasachama after nighttime, over ba'aseh, violates a positive commandment. The positive commandment being, we mentioned before, like Rabbi Aglili, guard this commandment on these days, and Rabbi Aglili derived days, not night, and therefore if you do put on tefillin night, you're violating that commandment, which says guard it on these days. Rabbi Yochanan says, over balav, you actually violate not a positive commandment, but a negative commandment, that is a prohibition, as opposed to a violation of a positive commandment.
It's interesting.
And this is the halacha according to Rambam.
He defines the night right away after Shkiyat HaChama, not Sikh
Maybe out of Suffolk. But anyway, okay. What's the difference between, or not what's the difference? Why would you say it's a positive commandment or a negative commandment? So let's learn. Leima says the Gemara, let us suggest, that Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Lezer, who are arguing in the view of Rabbi Saglili. Rabbi Saglili is the one who said, like the Rambam, that it's a biblical injunction not to wear tefillin at night. And Rabbi Eliezer says that injunction is a positive commandment. Do not wear a positive commandment, meaning only wear tefillin during the day. Or Rabbi Yochanan says it's a negative commandment. Do not wear tefillin at night. How do they come to those different conclusions if we're talking about the same verse? So the Gemara suggests the following: they're discussing or they're disputing over a statement by Rabbi Abin in the name of Rabbi Lo. To Amr Rabbi Abin, Amr Rabbi Lo. For Rabbi Abin said in Rabbi Lo, Kol makom shneimar hishamer pen v'al. Whenever the verse employs the word hishamer, guard, pen, lest, al, don't. If that's the way the verse introduces the commandment, Einan ela say it's nothing other than a negative commandment. And therefore, when the verse here says guard this law to keep it during the days, so it opens up with hishamer, guard. The shamarta in this case, but it's the same thing. It's a guard. It's the root word. It's the root word of guard, and therefore, it's a negative commandment. Guard it, because whenever it says guard, it means don't do it this way.
Going back to the Shabbat,
and thus it remains a then if you are of the view that like Rabbi Abin, that the word hishamer, the word guard or shamarta, means a negative commandment, then you would say we're in tefillin at night is a violation of a negative commandment. And therefore, Tamar Isli Rababin, Rabbi Lezer, Rabbi Yochanan, which said that it's a prohibition that you're violating, that he would follow Rabbi Abin's view, which says that the word shamarta means do not, means a negative commandment. Umar Lesli Rabbi Abin, and Rabbi Lezer, who says it's only Rabbi Lezer says it's a violation of a positive commandment, he would say, I disagree with you. And just because it says guard, it doesn't mean it's a negative commandment. It could be a positive commandment. Guard it to do it in this fashion. Excuse me. No, it isn't negative, period.
Oh, not negative, period.
That's right.
That's his
it's
view.
Positive, according to Rabbi Lezer.
Probably does. Even if there's a word shamar.
That's correct. The Gemara then suggests no.
We both agree.
I'm going to push a little bit fast here because I want to conclude it today. The Gemara says, "Loi, no." We might suggest that they actually both agree with the principle that whenever the verse says guard, it actually does mean a negative commandment. Right? Now, if that's the case, it does mean a negative commandment.
Does mean.
Now, if that's the case, why would Rabbi Lezer say over here it's a positive commandment you're violating if the verse employs the word hishamer, guard? So the Gemara explains. Here's the dispute. Mar Somer Hishavar de Lav Lav, Vishomer da Aseh Aseh, Mar Sover Hishomer da Aseh Nami Lav. Okay. Meaning to say like this. It's all contextual. When the verse says, guard this law, if that were the only word, everybody would agree. If that's the only commandment, everybody would agree it's a negative commandment. However, when we say guard, but we're telling you to guard a positive commandment stated elsewhere, like this case. Here's the positive commandment, put on your tefillin, and then there's another verse that says guard that positive commandment. So since I've attached a guard to a positive commandment, does it now take on the role of a guard, namely a negative commandment, or because it's put it in the context of a positive commandment elsewhere, does it retain the status of a positive commandment? And that's the dispute. So even though Rabbi Lezer and Rabbi Yochanan both agree in the principle that whenever the word guard is there, it's a negative commandment, it's a prohibition, but because here it's in the context and it's attached to a positive commandment, do I say, because it says guard, it takes on the life of its own as a negative commandment, and that's the view of Rabbi Yochanan, whereas Rabbi Lezer says no, because the guard is in the context of a positive commandment, elsewhere it retains the status of a positive commandment, and therefore it's a violation of positive commandment to put on tefillin at night. But neither of these are halacha, except for the Rambam. But from the Shulchan Aruch, neither of these are halacha because we say it's only a rabbinic prohibition because it might fall asleep. And this is the closing statement. This halacha that we just mentioned, that it's a rabbinic prohibition because it might fall asleep. So let's see. Rabbi Lezer says, "Im l'shamron," if you're putting on your tefillin to guard them, meaning not for the sake of the mitzvah. Well, actually, even if this is biblical, you would agree with this. Even if it's a biblical prohibition, you would still agree with the statement that if you're putting on a tefillin not for the sake of the mitzvah, but rather for the sake of the guarding them, you found them on the street and you don't want them to get ruined, so you're putting them on, then mutter, it is, no, even on at night.
Night you move.
Yeah.
Talking about night, sorry.
You don't want them to get lost, So you put them on, then mutter, it's permissible.
Oh, okay, same problem.
Same issue.
Same issue.
And furthermore, Vamar Ravina says, Esvina committed Rav Ashi. I was sitting in the presence of Rav Ashi. V'choshach, and it got dark. V'iniach tefillin, and he put on his tefillin at night. V'amrilei, so I told him, L'shalman kaboy umar. Presumably, master, you Rav Ashi, want to guard it, and that's why you're putting them on now. Presumably.
Right.
V'amarli, and Rav Ashi told me, that's correct. I'm putting them on because I want to guard them. But, says Ravina, but I observed him, and I could tell that he wasn't putting them on to guard them. He was putting them on because he wanted to put them on. And therefore, Kasavar is of the view that indeed the halacha is you're allowed to wear tefillin at night, meaning it's not a biblical prohibition, which is the way the Shulchan Aruch concludes. But the ein moedin kain. We don't instruct people to put on tefillin at night. Why? Because we're worried about people falling asleep. So halacha ein moedin kain means technically speaking you're allowed to wear tefillin at night, but we tell you don't because we don't want you to fall asleep. So Rav Ashi didn't want to tell me straight out, I'm putting on tefillin because I want to. He kind of just said, I'm doing it to guard, because he didn't want me to get the impression that you're supposed to wear tefillin at night because we're worried about people falling asleep. And this remains the halacha. Now what about the Rambam?
So you can't.
The Rambam which says that it's actually a biblical prohibition to wear tefillin at night. So what does he make of this statement in the Gemara, which says that Rav Ashi put on tefillin at nighttime?
Not to watch them. Just not to watch.
Not to watch them, just to put them on.
Watching, we would agree, but.
So he says he put on tefillin.
In the street.
No, he put on tefillin
Or home.
before,
Wonders they're on.
and he left them on.
Yeah.
Who, Ross?
Rambam,
Oh,
Rav Ashi.
because Rambam says
You can't put them on.
that you can't put them on at night because it's a biblical prohibition.
That's right.
And he says that it's talking about putting on tefillin before nightfall, and he kept them on, and even keeping them on, we shouldn't tell people to do it. Whereas we're saying, if you have them on and you're keeping them on to guard them, that's okay. But we don't tell people to put them on to begin with at night because you might fall asleep. Rambam says, even putting them on before tefillin and leaving them on at night to guard them, even that we don't tell people to begin with because they don't want people falling asleep. Because the Rambam says putting them on to begin with is a biblical prohibition. So there's no need for a concern. It's a biblical prohibition. The concern is only putting them on before and leaving them on. Okay, so this concludes our discussion with respect to the limits on when the times of tefillin, night and Shabbos. And God willing, tomorrow we'll get to proper concentration while wearing tefillin, which will lead to the discussion of wearing tefillin all day.
And also the word hanira, because it actually means putting on initially or leaving.